For most of our evolution, death left no clear sign of ceremony. Then, deep in a South African cave, a small-brained human relative left bodies in places some researchers interpret as graves. If they are right, one of humanity's oldest rituals began in a vanished lineage, not with us. Yet the evidence remains disputed. So, 300,000 years ago, did a tiny-brained human bury its dead? And why can science still not explain why? The story begins not with a skull displayed beneath museum lights, but with a narrow opening in the limestone of South Africa. Beyond that opening lies the Rising Star Cave System, a hidden world of passages, slopes, chambers, and complete darkness. In 2013, two experienced cavers entered this underground maze while searching for fossil sites. Deep inside, they noticed bones scattered across the floor of a remote chamber. Some were small, some were partly buried in pale sediment. At first, there was no reason to imagine that these fragments would alter the way scientists thought about the human family. Yet, even before the bones had names, their location created a quiet problem. They were not resting near daylight, where animals might fall through an entrance or where water could easily carry remains. They lay far inside a place that was difficult for modern explorers to reach. Recovering them required a team able to move through extremely confined spaces without damaging either the fossils or the cave. The researchers who descended into the chamber worked slowly, recording the position of each visible fragment before lifting it from the ground. What emerged was not a single skeleton. The collection included parts of skulls, teeth, jaws, hands, feet, ribs, arms, legs, and other bones belonging to multiple individuals. Adults were present, along with younger individuals. Many regions of the body were represented more than once, showing that the chamber held the remains of a group rather than one unfortunate visitor. This abundance mattered because the fossil record of ancient humans is often built from isolated teeth, broken jaws, or a few incomplete bones. Here, scientists faced a large collection from one previously unknown kind of human relative. The bones also carried an unusual mixture of features. Some looked familiar enough to place the population within the genus Homo, while others recalled much earlier branches of human evolution. The feet and lower limbs suggested a creature adapted to walking upright. The hands combined a wrist suited to forceful gripping with curved fingers that retained older anatomical patterns. The shoulders, trunk, and pelvis appeared more primitive than many scientists expected from a comparatively recent member of our genus. Most strikingly, the skulls enclosed brains much smaller than those of living humans. None of these observations revealed what the individuals had done in life or how their bodies reached the chamber. Bones preserve shape more readily than intention. A curved finger can suggest patterns of movement, and a joint can indicate how weight passed through a limb, but no fossil records a memory, a bond, or a decision. The discovery, therefore, began with description rather than explanation. Researchers first had to determine whether the remains belonged to one species, whether the bones had accumulated during a single event or across a longer interval, and whether geological processes had changed their positions. The darkness of the chamber was important, but darkness alone could not prove deliberate action. The difficulty of entering it was important, but the route visible today may not perfectly reproduce the cave as it existed when the bodies arrived. Even the unusual concentration of remains demanded caution, because underground environments can preserve the results of processes that no living observer witnessed. What could be said with confidence was narrower, and in some ways more powerful. A population of human relatives had existed in southern Africa. Their bodies combined ancient and more familiar traits. Several of those bodies, or their remains, came to rest deep within rising star. Long after their lineage disappeared, fragments of bone waited in clay and silence until modern hands carried them back toward the surface. Each recovered fragment returned anatomy to science, while the vanished journey through the cave remained almost entirely beyond reconstruction. The first mystery was not yet whether they had buried their dead. It was how a forgotten form of humanity had entered the darkness at all. When the first bones of Homo naledi were studied, their anatomy seemed to point backward into an older world. The skull was small, the shoulders recalled earlier hominins, and the curved fingers suggested a body that still carried traces of climbing. Yet the feet were suited to upright walking, and parts of the hands and legs belonged unmistakably within a human pattern. This mixture did not fit comfortably into a simple sequence in which one kind of human gradually replaced another with a larger brain, a more modern body, and more complex behavior. At first, some researchers expected the fossils to be extremely ancient because several features looked primitive. The cave, however, did not easily offer an age. Bones in underground chambers are often difficult to date directly, especially when they are not found beside volcanic ash or other materials that provide a clear geological clock. Scientists therefore use several methods, examining the fossils, the sediments around them, and mineral deposits that formed in the cave. The results placed Homo naledi far later than its anatomy had suggested. The remains were estimated to be roughly between 230,000 and 330,000 years old. That range overlapped with a period when early populations related to our own species were already present in Africa. The surprise was not that evolution had produced another small-brained hominin. Many such forms had existed before. The surprise was that a body carrying so many ancient features had survived into a comparatively recent time, sharing the continent with other humans whose skulls and bodies followed different evolutionary paths. This discovery weakened the old image of human evolution as a single ladder. A ladder allows only one direction and one occupant on each step. The fossil record instead resembles a landscape crossed by branching paths. Some lineages changed quickly in certain features and slowly in others. Some retained ancient anatomy while developing new ways of moving. Some survived long after related forms disappeared. Homo naledi may have belonged to a branch that separated early and endured in southern Africa for a long time, but its exact ancestry remains uncertain. No complete sequence of fossils connects it neatly to an earlier population, and no genetic material has yet revealed its closest relatives. Its body therefore stands as evidence of survival without offering a family history. The dating also deepened the mystery inside Rising Star. If the fossils had been millions of years old, scientists might have treated the chamber mainly as a rare window into a distant stage of human evolution. Instead, the remains came from a time much closer to the emergence of Homo sapiens. This did not prove that the two populations met, exchanged ideas, or even lived in the same local environment. Africa is vast, and similar dates do not establish direct contact. Still, their coexistence means that different kinds of humans may have inhabited the continent during overlapping generations. One population carried a relatively large brain and anatomy closer to ours. Another retained a brain not much larger than that of much earlier hominins, yet walked upright and survived in a landscape. The bones could not reveal how Homo naledi communicated, organized its groups, found food, or responded to danger. They could only show that evolutionary success was not measured by resemblance to modern humans. For an unknown span of time, this lineage lived, reproduced, raised young, and passed through generations without moving toward our anatomy. Its survival was not a failed attempt to become us. It was another human way of existing, complete in its own time. That realization matters because the question of the dead bodies in the cave depends partly on what scientists expect a small-brained human to be capable of doing. Before the chamber can be interpreted, the assumption that ancient-looking anatomy must belong to an ancient and simple mind has to be set aside. Once the age of Homo naledi became clear, the chamber and rising star could no longer be treated as a window into a world separated from us by millions of years. Its occupants lived during a period when the African continent held more than one kind of human. In the north, early populations belonging to the emerging Homo sapiens lineage were already present. Elsewhere, other hominin groups may also have survived, each shaped by its own environment, history, and long chain of ancestors. Similar dates do not prove that these populations met. They do not show that they exchanged tools, shared territory, competed for food, or even knew of one another's existence. Africa was enormous. Habitats shifted across great distances, and the fossil record preserves only scattered traces. Yet the overlap matters because it removes the comfort of a simple succession. Human history was not a procession in which one form stepped aside as soon as another appeared. It was a branching world in which different bodies, different brains, and different ways of surviving could persist at the same time. Homo naledi carried this complexity in its skeleton. Its small brain case and older-looking shoulders belonged beside feet, built for upright walking and hands capable of precise control. That combination was not a half-finished stage on the road to modern humanity. Evolution has no planned destination, and a lineage does not fail because it does not become us. For generation after generation, these people survived well enough to grow, reproduce, move through their landscape, and raise young who carried the same unusual pattern of traits. Their existence reminds us that the human beginning was not one moment and not one body. It was a long history of populations separating, adapting, enduring, and disappearing, often without leaving descendants that we can identify. The cave preserves only one narrow fragment of that larger history. It does not reveal where Homo naledi lived above ground, what food sustained them, how large their groups were, or how far they traveled. No confirmed set of tools can yet be assigned to them with certainty. No preserved voice tells us how individuals recognized one another or responded when a member of the group died. These absences are important because the question raised by the chamber is a question about behavior, while most surviving evidence concerns anatomy and geology. Scientists can compare teeth, joints, sediments, mineral layers, and the positions of bones. They can test whether water moved through a passage or whether animals left marks on a skeleton. They cannot directly recover a decision made hundreds of thousands of years ago. This is where assumptions become dangerous. A small brain may encourage observers to imagine limited behavior, just as a large brain may tempt them to expect symbolism or ritual. Neither conclusion follows automatically from skull size. Modern science can measure the space once occupied by a brain, but it cannot reconstruct every connection within it, every learned habit shared by a group, or every response shaped by social life. The origin of human behavior may therefore be less orderly than the origin stories we prefer. Capacities that seem closely linked in our own species may have evolved separately, appeared in different degrees, or been expressed by lineages with bodies unlike ours. This possibility does not prove that Homo naledi buried the dead. It only explains why the claim cannot be dismissed before the physical evidence is examined. The remains in Rising Star belong to a lineage that lived beside the early history of our own. yet followed another evolutionary path. Their bones reveal that multiple forms of humanity occupied the same broad age. That shared age makes the cave important, but it does not make its silence easier to interpret with confidence. What happened in the darkness must now be judged without assuming that only one of them could behave in ways that still seem familiar. The body of Homo naledi did not belong neatly to one familiar stage of human evolution. It carried features that, when viewed separately, seemed to come from different periods. The skull was low and small, with a brain case closer in size to those of much earlier hominins than to our own. The shoulders were positioned high, and the upper body retained a shape often compared with older members of the human family. The rib cage widened toward the lower region of the torso, while the pelvis preserved features unlike the narrow form seen in living humans. Yet below that trunk, the legs and feet told a different story. The foot was largely adapted for walking upright on the ground. Its overall structure included a firm heel, an arch, and a big toe, aligned with the others rather than spreading outward for grasping. These traits indicate that upright walking was not an occasional experiment for this population. It was woven into the ordinary way the body moved through the landscape. Even here, however, the anatomy was not identical to ours. Some details of the toes and ankles suggest that its walking pattern may not have matched that of a modern person in every respect. The hands produced another contrast. The wrist and thumb possessed features associated with strong gripping and controlled manipulation. A long, powerful thumb could have helped the hand hold objects securely. At the same time, the finger bones were strongly curved, more than those of living humans. Curved fingers are often associated with repeated loading during climbing or grasping, but they do not reveal how often Homo naledi entered trees, what it did there, or whether all individuals moved in the same way. The skeleton therefore does not offer a simple choice between a ground-dwelling walker and a climbing ancestor. It suggests a body capable of upright travel while retaining upper limb structures inherited from an older pattern of movement. This arrangement is sometimes described as anatomical mosaicism, meaning that different regions of the body changed at different rates. Evolution did not rebuild the whole skeleton at once. A useful foot could become strongly adapted for long periods of walking, while the shoulder and fingers continued to preserve forms shaped by earlier generations. Teeth added another layer to the mixture. They were generally small compared with those of many earlier hominins, yet their shapes did not simply reproduce the pattern seen in Homo sapiens. The face and jaw belonged to a combination that was recognizably distinct. Scientists named a new species not because one bone appeared strange, but because the repeated pattern across many bones could not be comfortably placed within a known population. Still, a species name is not a complete biography. These structures cannot tell us the color of the skin, the amount of body hair, the sounds made during movements, or the daily distances traveled. Muscles, tendons, and soft tissues are mostly gone, leaving researchers to infer function from attachment points, joint surfaces, proportions, and comparisons with other primates. Such inferences are strongest when several regions of the body agree, and weakest when one feature is asked to carry an entire story. The mosaic body of Homo naledi is important because it warns against arranging ancient humans from simple to advanced. Its feet were not waiting to become human feet, and its curved fingers were not signs of failure. Each feature had passed through generations because the whole organism continued to survive. Long before any body entered the depths of Rising Star, this lineage had already found a workable balance between inherited anatomy and the demands of its environment. No single trait can be treated as a direct measure of intelligence, social feeling, memory, or the ability to respond meaningfully when another nearby individual died. The bones in the cave preserve that balance, but they do not yet reveal what kind of mind once directed it. The small brain case of Homo naledi invites an easy conclusion, but it is a conclusion the fossils cannot support. Compared with the brain case of a living human, the space inside its skull was limited. Different individuals varied, yet the known range remained closer to that of Australopiths than to the average size seen in our species. For much of the history of paleoanthropology, such measurements were often arranged along an imagined scale. A larger brain was treated as evidence of greater intelligence, more complicated social life, better tools, and behavior closer to our own. Brain expansion was certainly an important feature in several branches of human evolution, but size alone does not provide a reliable map of a vanished mind. A skull preserves only the container and some impressions left by tissues that once rested against its inner surface. Researchers can create an endocast, a reconstruction of that interior space, and examine broad patterns of shape. In Homo naledi, these reconstructions suggest that a small brain could still share some organizational features with other members of the genus Homo. That observation is important, but it must not be stretched beyond the evidence. An endocast cannot show individual nerve cells, the density of their connections, the chemistry that supported learning, or the experiences that shaped a brain during life. It cannot reveal vocabulary, memory, empathy, planning, or belief. Even among living animals, cognitive ability is not explained by total brain volume in a simple way. Body size matters, different brain regions perform different tasks, and nervous systems can organize information through arrangements that a single measurement overlooks. Social learning also exists outside the skull. A behavior discovered by one individual may be copied, repeated, and passed to younger members of a group. In this way, knowledge can become more complex across generations without requiring every useful response to be genetically rebuilt. Whether Homo naledi possessed such traditions is unknown. No surviving evidence allows us to describe its teaching, communication, or social rules. Yet the possibility reminds us why anatomy cannot be translated directly into a fixed limit on behavior. The same caution must be applied in the opposite direction. Features of the frontal region that appear more human-like than expected do not prove language, symbolic thought, ritual, or an understanding of death. Similar shape does not guarantee identical function, especially across a lineage separated from us by an uncertain evolutionary history. Researchers are studying shadows left by a brain, not the living organ itself. This uncertainty reaches directly into the chamber at Rising Star. If bodies were intentionally placed there, the action would challenge the assumption that mortuary behavior required a brain as large as ours. But using that possible behavior to prove advanced cognition would create a circle. The burial would be accepted because the brain was complex, and the brain would be called complex because burial was assumed. The physical evidence for how the remains accumulated must therefore stand on its own. Brain size may shape the questions scientists ask, but it cannot decide the answer before sediments, bone positions, cave processes, and alternative explanations have been examined. The deeper lesson concerns the beginning of humanity itself. Our lineage did not acquire every familiar capacity in one package when the skull crossed a particular volume. Changes in movement, hands, development, social dependence, learning, and brain organization unfolded through different branches and at different rates. Homo naledi preserves one unfamiliar combination. Its small brain was part of a body that survived across many generations. but neither its dimensions nor its surface impressions can tell us what those generations understood when one life ended. That question remains open because cognition does not fossilize as a complete record. It leaves indirect traces in bodies, objects, spaces, and repeated actions. Each trace can narrow what was possible, but none can fully restore the private experience of a mind that disappeared with its species. Giving Homo naledi a scientific name did not place it securely on the human family tree. The name identified a repeated anatomical pattern, but ancestry requires a different kind of evidence. Researchers must compare many features across many fossils, decide which similarities were inherited from a common ancestor, and distinguish them from traits that may have evolved independently. That task becomes difficult when a body combines an ancient-looking skull and upper torso with hands, feet, and legs that resemble later members of Homo. Depending on which features receive greater weight, Homo naledi can appear closer to different branches. Some analyses place it among early members of our genus, while others leave several possible relationships unresolved. The fossils do not identify a known ancestor, and they do not establish that this population gave rise to any later species. Its lineage may have separated from another branch long before the individuals in Rising Star were born. The age of a fossil records when that individual lived, not when its species first appeared. A population can retain an anatomical pattern for a very long time, especially if that pattern continues to work within a stable way of life. This creates a hidden interval in the history of Homo naledi. The known remains belong to a comparatively recent period, yet some elements of the body suggest deeper roots. Between those roots and the cave lies a record that has not been found. There may have been earlier populations whose sediments were never preserved or never examined. There may also be fossils already held in collections that are too incomplete to recognize as Homo naledi. These possibilities remain possibilities, not discoveries. They show why the absence of transitional specimens cannot be filled with a confident story. A family tree built from fossils is not like a written genealogy. It is a model assembled from surviving anatomy. New material can strengthen one arrangement, weaken another, or reveal that branches once considered separate shared a more complicated history. Similar teeth may reflect close relationship, similar diets. A familiar shape in the hand may have been inherited, while another feature may have emerged through adaptation to comparable demands. Scientists therefore speak of likely relationships rather than reading descent directly from bone. For the people whose remains entered Rising Star, this uncertainty means that even the word human must be used carefully. Homo naledi belongs within the human lineage, yet it was not a smaller version of Homo sapiens and should not be imagined as an unfinished modern person. Its ancestors followed. The population may have existed beside other forms of Homo without contributing directly to our ancestry. It may represent one of many experiments produced by branching evolution, though the word experiment describes no intention. Natural selection does not test bodies with a future goal. It preserves enough variation for populations to continue under present conditions. This unresolved position also changes how the cave question must be approached. If Homo naledi were assumed to be a direct ancestor of our species, any treatment of the dead might be interpreted as an early step toward modern ritual. If it were placed on a distant branch, the same evidence might suggest that attention to dead bodies emerged more than once. Neither interpretation is justified before deliberate placement itself is demonstrated. The family tree cannot prove the burial, and the proposed burial cannot be used to force the family tree into a preferred shape. What remains is a vanished lineage, with an anatomy unlike any living population, preserved late in time but rooted somewhere deeper than the fossils can reach. Its uncertain ancestry is not an empty detail. It is a reminder that the beginning of human behavior may have unfolded across branches whose names, relationships, and inner lives remain only incompletely visible. To understand why the remains in Rising Star created such a difficult question, it helps to follow the route that modern explorers must take. The journey begins in ordinary daylight, where the South African landscape gives no clear sign of the hidden chambers below. Once inside the cave, the open air narrows into passages shaped by water, moving through limestone over immense periods. The floor rises and falls. Rock presses close to the shoulders. In places, a person must lower the body almost flat and move forward using elbows, knees, and careful pressure from the feet. Farther in, the route climbs over a steep ridge of stone before turning toward a narrow descent into the naledi chamber. The final approach is not a doorway in the familiar sense. It is a confined vertical passage through which only a relatively small body can move with ease. Equipment must be passed carefully. Every movement is controlled because a careless shift can damage the walls, disturb sediment, or place the explorer at risk. Beyond that descent, the chamber opens enough for a person to work, but it remains separated from the surface by darkness, distance, and constricted rock. This modern route is one reason the fossils appear so unusual. Carrying or guiding a dead body through such a sequence would be difficult. Moving many bodies would seem more difficult still. Yet the cave seen today cannot simply be projected unchanged into the distant past. Limestone caves are not frozen structures. Cracks widen, ceilings fracture, sediment accumulates, passages become blocked, and water slowly reshapes surfaces. The path available when Homo naledi lived may not have matched every bend and restriction known to explorers. Now, at the same time, geological investigations have not identified a clear, large entrance that once opened directly into the naledi chamber. The chamber appears to have remained within the dark region of the cave, far from natural light. This combination demands restraint. The present difficulty of access matters, but it does not provide a perfect measurement of the journey made by ancient bodies. The unknown route matters, but it cannot be treated as an imagined easy entrance without evidence. Between those limits lies the real archaeological problem. At the beginning of the human story, bodies evolved in landscapes of open ground, woodland, rock shelter, and water. Movement was shaped by the feet, hands, balance, and memory of routes through familiar territory. Homo naledi had a body capable of upright walking and upper limbs that retained climbing-related features, yet no skeleton can tell us how confidently these people entered enclosed spaces. They may have known parts of the cave well, entered them rarely, or avoided them except under unusual circumstances. None of these possibilities is preserved as fact. Even the light available to them is unknown. Fire has not been securely demonstrated as part of the journey that brought the naledi remains into place. Without a reliable light source, movement through complete darkness would require touch, memory, or some other method that cannot be reconstructed from the fossils alone. Modern lamps make the route visible, while also hiding how unfamiliar and dangerous the same space might have been to an ancient population. The cave, therefore, creates two very different scales of time. Human movement occurred over minutes or hours, through a route experienced one step at a time. Geological change occurred gradually across thousands of generations, altering passages without recording every earlier shape. Scientists meet both histories in the same chamber, but they cannot watch either process unfold. Rock preserves destinations more reliably than the movements, pauses, and choices that led there. What remains is a mapped route in the present, a partially reconstructed cave history, and a concentration of ancient human bones at the end of darkness. Before asking whether the dead were carried there intentionally, we must first accept that the exact path they followed has not survived intact. The position of the Homo naledi remains is more difficult to explain than their number alone. Ancient bones can gather in caves through many ordinary processes. Animals may drag carcasses into sheltered spaces, water may carry isolated bones through channels, individuals may fall through openings, become trapped, or die near an entrance that later collapses. In the naledi chamber, however, the known evidence does not resemble the clearest versions of these familiar patterns. The chamber lies within the dark interior of the rising star system, beyond the reach of daylight. The hominin remains are not mixed with a broad collection of large animal bodies that would suggest a common natural trap. Nor has a direct vertical shaft been demonstrated above the chamber through which many individuals could simply have fallen. These observations make the location unusual, but unusual does not mean understood. The fossils were recovered from sediments spread across parts of the chamber, with some bones visible at the surface and others embedded below it. They represent individuals of different ages, including adults and younger members of the population. Their presence, therefore, cannot easily be reduced to one body entering during one isolated accident. Something occurred more than once, or one event involved several individuals. But the surviving record does not yet reveal which possibility is correct. The difference matters because repeated arrival can imply a recurring process, while a single episode may have a different cause. Geology can sometimes separate such histories, yet cave sediments are difficult archives. Soil may be disturbed by water dripping from above, small animals moving through loose material, later visitors, changes in humidity, or the slow settling of the chamber floor. Bones can shift after soft tissues disappear. A hand or foot that was once connected may separate, while nearby fragments may remain close enough to preserve part of their original arrangement. Scientists must therefore reconstruct not only where a body ended, but how the surrounding sediment behaved before, during, and after decomposition. The absence of sunlight adds another question. A body arriving in the chamber did not merely cross a distance on a map. It passed from an outside world of vegetation, weather, sound, and visible landmarks into an enclosed environment where ordinary orientation became difficult. For the earliest human populations, landscapes were known through repeated movement, memory, and sensory attention. A deep cave belonged to a different kind of space. Yet darkness itself cannot tell us whether Homo naledi feared, valued, ignored, or understood that space. Such emotions would be inventions placed over the evidence. We can say only that the remains reached a location where natural light did not guide the final approach. If living individuals carried the dead inward, they needed some way to navigate. If bodies arrived through an unknown geological route, that route must be demonstrated rather than assumed. If the individuals entered alive, researchers must explain why several of them ended in the same remote region and why the surrounding fossil pattern lacks some signs expected from a typical trap. Each explanation solves one difficulty while creating another. This is why the chamber became central to a much larger question about the beginning of human behavior. The place does not prove ceremony, grief, or belief. It does not show that a grave was opened or that a body was covered. It shows that members of a vanished human lineage came to rest deep underground in a context that resists a simple account. Their bones preserve the destination, while light, movement, and intention disappeared with the people who knew the route. Before any claim of burial can be accepted, the chamber must be treated neither as an obvious tomb nor as an ordinary accident, but as a physical problem whose remaining explanations must be tested one by one. That restraint is essential because a compelling location can shape interpretation long before the sediment has yielded an answer. The deeper a mystery appears, the easier it becomes to mistake difficulty for proof. Rising Star is difficult to enter, difficult to map, and difficult to imagine as a place where several bodies arrived without help. Yet none of those facts can decide by themselves whether Homo naledi deliberately placed the dead there. Archaeology advances by comparing explanations, not by choosing the most emotionally powerful one. One possibility is that living individuals entered the cave and became trapped. Another is that bodies or bones moved through passages that are now blocked or poorly understood. A third is that members of the group carried the dead into the darkness. Each proposal must be tested against the same evidence: the distribution of bones, the condition of the sediments, the absence or presence of animal damage, the shape of the chamber, and the geological history of every known route. A natural explanation does not need to feel simple. Caves can produce complicated results through slow collapse, shifting soil, water movement, and repeated disturbance. Small changes acting over long periods can rearrange a scene until its original form is hard to recognize. At the same time, invoking an unknown natural process without evidence is no more careful than assuming ritual. The fact that caves change does not permit researchers to invent a vanished entrance whenever the present route seems inconvenient. A former passage must leave geological traces, just as an intentional grave must leave archaeological traces. This balance is essential because the question reaches back toward the origin of human behavior. The earliest members of our lineage did not leave written motives, and their actions survive only when they change durable materials. A path through darkness disappears. A body decomposes. A memory held by a group vanishes when the final generation dies. What remains may be only a concentration of bones and a floor of sediment. From that limited record, scientists must separate what is observed from what is inferred. The bones are observed, their depth within the cave is observed, the presence of several individuals is observed. Deliberate transport, accidental entry, repeated use, and symbolic meaning are interpretations that require further support. This distinction does not weaken the importance of the discovery. It protects it. If the evidence eventually supports deliberate placement, the conclusion will matter because competing explanations were tested rather than ignored. If a geological process provides a better account, that result will also teach us something important about how easily ancient spaces can mislead modern eyes. The goal is not to preserve a dramatic idea. It is to find the explanation that leaves the fewest contradictions. For now, the chamber remains suspended between possibilities. Its darkness makes human action imaginable, but not certain. Its geology keeps natural processes possible, but not automatically sufficient. The route is too difficult to dismiss, yet too altered by time to reconstruct with confidence. This uncertainty should not be filled with imagined scenes of mourning, fear, or ceremony. We do not know who entered, who carried, who watched, or whether anyone returned. We do not know whether the bodies arrived whole, whether the same route was used each time, or whether the chamber had a meaning beyond its physical depth. That work begins at a smaller scale than the claim. A tooth displaced by a few centimeters, a joint still aligned, a layer of clay crossing beneath a bone, or a mark left on a surface may carry more value than any imagined reconstruction of the chamber's final moments for science today. The evidence allows a narrower conclusion. A vanished human population became connected to this underground place through a process that has not yet been fully explained. The next task is not to guess what that process felt like, but to ask what the bones themselves can still reveal about the condition in which the bodies entered, and the changes that followed after death. The bones in the naledi chamber did not belong to one individual whose accidental death could explain the deposit. They came from many bodies represented by repeated teeth, jaws, skull fragments, vertebrae, ribs, hands, feet, and long bones. Researchers determine a minimum number of individuals by looking for anatomical elements that could not have come from the same body. Two left upper arm bones of the same developmental stage require at least two individuals. Several jaws with incompatible shapes or ages require more. Teeth are especially useful because children grow one set and later replace it, allowing scientists to distinguish immature individuals from adults without inventing names, relationships, or histories. Using this conservative method, the naledi collection was shown to contain the remains of at least 15 individuals. The true number may have been higher because many fragments cannot be assigned securely, and repeated pieces are counted only when duplication is clear. This is not a cemetery population in this sense, because the evidence does not reveal a complete community or a single moment of death. It is a surviving sample shaped by deposition, decay, geological change, excavation, and chance. Within that sample were individuals at different stages of life. Some teeth were still developing. Other bones had not completed the changes that occur as a young body matures. Adult remains were present as well, including individuals whose skeletons had reached growth. The mixture shows that the chamber was not reserved only for one age group, but it does not prove that all ages entered in equal numbers or for the same reason. A child and an adult found near one another were not necessarily related. They may have lived generations apart. Without genetic evidence or a sequence of deposition, calling them parent and child would turn proximity into a story the fossils cannot support. Even biological sex is difficult to estimate for many individuals because the skeletons are incomplete and Homo naledi does not necessarily display differences identical to those used when studying living humans. The responsible description is modest. Multiple members of the same extinct species, including younger and older individuals, became incorporated into deposits deep within the cave. That modest statement carries weight. At the beginning of the human story, death occurred across every stage of life, but the fossil record rarely preserves enough members of one population to reveal its biological range. Rising Star offers skulls of different sizes, teeth at different moments of development, and limb bones showing variation among individuals. Together, they help scientists distinguish ordinary variation from features that define the species. An unusual bone might be damaged or exceptional. The same pattern repeated across many bodies is stronger evidence of shared anatomy. Yet, abundance also complicates the central question. If several individuals reach the chamber through accidental falls, natural transport, or entrapment, the same process had to operate in a way consistent with their varied ages and the setting. If bodies were placed there deliberately, the behavior must have occurred more than once or involved several individuals within one episode. Neither conclusion follows from age diversity alone. The young do not prove family care, and the adults do not prove repeated ceremony. Their bones establish a population-level pattern, not the motives behind it. The distinction between individuals and relationships is crucial because human minds connect the dead into families. We imagine someone carrying a small body, another person returning to the same place, and generations remembering a route through darkness. Such scenes may be possible, but possibility is not evidence. Archaeology must begin with repeated elements: dental development, skeletal maturity, and spatial association before it can ask whether the chamber records accident, disposal, or burial. What Rising Star preserves is not a silent family portrait. It is a fragmented record of many lives, separated from their names and connections, yet joined by the fact that their remains entered the same hidden landscape. A skeleton does not remain as one object after death. Soft tissues weaken, joints loosen, and bones begin to separate under gravity, moisture, pressure, and disturbance. For the naledi remains, this process is central because it may reveal whether whole bodies entered the chamber or whether isolated bones arrived later. Some elements were found close to their expected anatomical positions, while others were scattered or mixed with fragments from different individuals. Partial association can preserve the outline of a body without preserving every joint. A hand may remain near the wrist, a foot near the lower leg, or a group of vertebrae near one another, even after much of the skeleton is separated. Such patterns matter because a connected arrangement is difficult to produce if bones traveled individually over a long distance. Yet connection alone is not absolute proof that a complete corpse was carried into place. A body could die elsewhere in the cave and shift only a short distance before decomposition ended. Sediment could also support certain joints while allowing lighter bones to move. Researchers therefore examine articulation at several levels. A fully articulated skeleton preserves most joints in their original order. A partly articulated skeleton retains only some connected regions. An associated cluster contains bones from one individual that remain near each other even when their joints have separated. Each level records a different balance between original placement and later change. In Rising Star, the remains are fragmentary, and many bones were recovered from disturbed or complex deposits. That makes it difficult to reconstruct a complete sequence for every individual. The question is not simply whether the bones were connected when found. It is whether the observed pattern fits better with bodies entering intact, bones being introduced after decomposition, or a mixture of both processes. Small bones offer useful clues. Fingers, toes, and delicate parts of the inner ear are more easily lost during transport than large limb bones. Their presence can suggest that at least some bodies decomposed within or near the chamber rather than being reduced to selected pieces elsewhere. At the same time, the absence of a bone may reflect excavation limits, later movement, decay, or the fact that it has not yet been recovered. No single missing element can carry the argument. The same caution applies to breakage. Fresh bone bends and fractures differently from dry bone, but pressure within a cave can damage remains long after death. Falling rock, sediment compression, and repeated contact can create patterns that resemble earlier trauma. Scientists must compare fracture surfaces, mineral staining, and the position of fragments before deciding when damage occurred. The orientation of bones also matters. Elements aligned by flowing water may point in similar directions, while bones settling from a decomposing body may collapse around a center. These patterns are rarely perfect, so they must be read together with sediment and chamber shape. This investigation returns to the beginning of human behavior, because the condition of the body changes the meaning of the journey. If intact corpses entered the chamber repeatedly, some agent had to move bodies that could not move themselves. If only separated bones arrived, the process might involve water, sediment, animals, accidental transfer, or deliberate collection. If living individuals entered and died there, their skeletons might remain where decomposition occurred, but researchers would need to explain why people of different ages repeatedly ended in the same remote space. Each possibility leaves a different physical signature, yet time has blurred those signatures. The chamber records decomposition more clearly than intention. It can show that joints loosened, bones shifted, and sediments accumulated, but it cannot directly reveal who was present during those changes. What remains is a careful comparison between patterns expected from whole bodies and patterns expected from transported remains. That comparison cannot yet deliver a simple answer, but it narrows the range of histories that the cave can reasonably contain. When scientists examine the naledi remains, they also search for what is missing. Clear tooth marks might suggest that carnivores carried bodies or fed on them. Heavy rounding and polish could indicate movement through water. Repeated impact fractures might point toward falling, trampling, or rock collapse. A concentration of only the largest bones could imply that smaller elements were washed away. Yet the absence of these signs must be handled with care. A bone that shows no tooth mark does not prove that no animal ever touched the body. A chamber without obvious water sorting does not prove that water played no role at any stage. Preservation is uneven, surfaces are damaged, and many events leave traces too faint to survive for hundreds of thousands of years. The evidence can weaken an explanation without automatically establishing its opposite. This is one of the most important disciplines in archaeology. Researchers often work with incomplete patterns rather than complete scenes. If carnivores created the deposit, scientists would expect some combination of gnawing, punctures, digestion damage, missing small bones, or the presence of other prey. In Rising Star, the known assemblage does not strongly resemble a typical carnivore den. That makes large animal transport less convincing, but it does not eliminate every possible interaction with small scavengers or insects after death. Water movement faces a similar test. Flowing water tends to sort materials by size and weight, orient long bones, abrade exposed surfaces, and mix fossils with sediments carried from elsewhere. Some geological observations argue against a powerful stream transporting many bodies into the chamber. Still, dripping water, brief flooding, or slow sediment movement may have altered small portions of the deposit without producing a dramatic signature. The question is not whether water existed in the cave, but whether it can explain how so many human remains reached that location. At the beginning of human history, death did not enter the fossil record as a complete event. It entered as scattered material exposed to weather, animals, soil, chemistry, and chance. Every surviving skeleton is therefore the product of both life and everything that happened afterward. Scientists call these later changes post-depositional processes. But the idea is simple. The place where a bone is found may not be exactly where the body first rested, and the condition of the bone may reflect events long after death. In naledi, sediments could settle, crack, or shift. Small animals might disturb loose soil. Mineral deposits might strengthen one surface while another dissolve. Later movement by explorers could affect material near the chamber floor. These possibilities do not erase the evidence. They define how cautiously it must be read. The same restraint applies to trauma. A broken bone might record injury during life, damage around the time of death, or pressure that occurred much later. Without clear healing, fracture characteristics, and context, assigning cause can become guesswork. This matters because a fall into the chamber might leave a different pattern from a body placed gently on the ground. But ancient breakage rarely presents a perfect contrast. No single crack can reconstruct the final journey. The strongest conclusions come when anatomy, sediment, surface damage, spatial position, and cave geology all point in the same direction. A reconstruction must survive comparison with deposits elsewhere, including traps, dens, floods, and burials. Similarity never proves identity, but comparison shows which features are ordinary and which require a rarer cause. Without that discipline, an appealing mystery can harden into certainty before evidence has earned it. For now, the naledi evidence removes some simple explanations more effectively than it confirms one final account. The remains do not look like an ordinary predator accumulation, a clear water deposit, or an obvious mass fall. Yet, these absences are not themselves a grave. They leave a narrowed field of possibilities and a more precise question. What process can explain the whole pattern while requiring the fewest unsupported assumptions? Before a hollow in the ground can be called a grave, archaeology asks a more demanding question than whether human bones were found beneath sediment. Bodies can become covered without anyone digging, soil can fall from a ceiling, water can carry mud into a depression, and natural cracks can widen around, remains as the ground settles. A grave, in the most limited archaeological sense, requires evidence that a living individual or group intentionally altered a place to receive the dead. Usually this means that a pit was opened, a body was placed within it, and material was returned over the body. None of these actions requires religion, ceremony, spoken prayer, or belief in another life. Burial describes a physical process before it describes a meaning. This distinction is essential in Rising Star because the larger claim concerns behavior that cannot be observed directly. Scientists must first establish that the surrounding sediment records a human action rather than a natural sequence. One clue is a boundary where a pit cuts through an older layer. If the floor once formed a continuous surface, digging may interrupt that surface and create edges that differ from the undisturbed sediment nearby. The material inside the hollow may also differ in texture, structure, or arrangement because excavated earth was loosened and returned. Yet, a grave fill does not always look dramatically different. If the same soil was removed and replaced, color and composition may remain similar to the surrounding ground. Time can soften the edges, pressure can compress the fill, and minerals can spread across the boundary until the original cut becomes difficult to recognize. The position of a skeleton can provide another line of evidence. A body placed into a confined hollow may preserve joints, limbs, or a general arrangement that fits the shape of that hollow. Rapid covering can protect small bones from scattering and limit access by scavengers. Still, articulation is not unique to burial. A person who died naturally in a sheltered depression may also remain partly connected, while a buried body can later be disturbed by water, animals, sediment movement, or the collapse of the chamber floor. Grave goods, deliberate body posture, repeated placement, and differences in sediment chemistry can strengthen an interpretation, but none is universally required. Many human burials contain no objects, and decomposition can erase an original position. The strongest case appears when several independent observations agree: a cut into an earlier surface, a hollow shaped around a body, sediment returned after placement, anatomical relationships consistent with decomposition there, and no natural process that explains the same pattern more completely. Even then, burial does not reveal motive. A group might cover a body to reduce smell, discourage scavengers, protect a living space, follow a learned custom, or respond to social attachment. The archaeological record may demonstrate the act while leaving its purpose unreachable. This is especially important near the beginning of human history, where familiar modern meanings can easily be projected backward. A grave is not automatic proof of symbolic thought, and care for a corpse is not automatic proof of religion. For Homo naledi, researchers have proposed that certain concentrations of remains occupy shallow features cut into the cave floor and later filled with sediment. Other specialists argue that the published evidence has not yet demonstrated those cuts, fills, and body positions with enough clarity to exclude natural disturbance. The disagreement is therefore not simply about whether small-brained humans were capable of burial. It begins with a narrower material question. Does the cave floor preserve a deliberately created container for the dead? A compelling story about darkness and lost intelligence cannot replace that work, because the first duty of archaeology is to separate an altered deposit from an evocative place alone. Until that question is answered through excavation records, sediment analysis, and independent review, the word grave must remain a tested interpretation rather than a settled description. The proposed burial features in Rising Star are not obvious graves with clean walls, complete skeletons, and objects placed beside the dead. They are irregular concentrations of bone within a cave floor whose sediments have been altered by settling, moisture, erosion, and pressure. The researchers supporting deliberate burial focus on several patterns that they believe are difficult to explain as ordinary accumulation. In the naledi chamber, one concentration known as Feature 1 contains many skeletal elements associated with an adult individual. The bones occupy an area within sediment that appears different in arrangement from material outside. Parts of an orange-red laminated layer seem interrupted near the feature, and the fill around the remains has been described as disturbed or mixed. Supporters of the burial interpretation suggest that a hollow was opened through an earlier cave floor deposit, that a body was placed inside, and that loosened earth was returned over it. They also argue that the arrangement of the bones can be understood as the collapse of a body that entered while soft tissues still held much of the skeleton together. Some elements lie at different heights and angles rather than forming a flat scatter across the surface. This has been interpreted as a body placed within a confined space, perhaps with the limbs drawn closer to the torso, followed by decomposition and inward collapse. Yet the original posture cannot be observed directly. Much of the feature remains difficult to expose completely, and later movement may have changed relationships between bones. A small number of juvenile remains occur above or near the adult concentration, creating another uncertainty. They may represent later disturbance, overlapping deposits, or a more complicated history than a single body in a single grave. Nearby, another small concentration has been proposed as a second feature, possibly involving a younger individual. The published material from that location is more limited, so its boundaries, completeness, and anatomical coherence are harder to evaluate. In the hill antechamber, researchers identified another cluster containing remains from more than one individual. One partially associated skeleton has been described as lying in a flexed arrangement within an oval area of disturbed sediment. An articulated hand and nearby bones have been presented as signs that at least part of a body decomposed in place. The proposed hollow appears to differ from the surrounding floor, and some skeletal elements are supported within the sediment rather than resting only on its upper surface. These observations form the physical core of the burial argument. They do not depend on imagined grief or religion. They depend on whether the hollows were created, whether the sediment was replaced after bodies entered, and whether the bones preserve primary placement rather than natural concentration. Critics question each step. They argue that the visible limits of the proposed pits are incomplete, irregular, or insufficiently documented. Laminated cave mud can naturally crack, fragment, slump, and erode, producing boundaries that resemble disturbance. Differences between sediment containing decomposed bodies and sediment without fossils may also arise without digging. Overlapping individuals make it difficult to reconstruct original body positions, especially when not every element can be assigned securely. A nearly vertical bone may reflect collapse or sediment movement rather than intentional posture. The disagreement therefore rests on small physical details. A broken layer may be a cut made by hands, or it may be part of the cave floor's natural history. A compact group of bones may record a covered corpse or a body settling into an existing hollow. The same feature can look persuasive at one scale and uncertain at another. At the beginning of human mortuary behavior, there was no universal grave shape waiting to be copied. If Homo naledi buried bodies, its methods need not resemble later human cemeteries. But unfamiliarity cannot lower the standard of evidence. The proposed depressions, fills, and body positions make deliberate burial a testable explanation, not yet an unquestionable fact. The strongest argument for deliberate burial does not rest on one bone, one hollow, or the darkness of the cave. It emerges from the way several observations appear to converge. Human remains occur deep within rising star, in spaces where no clear natural entrance has been shown to deliver bodies from the surface. The assemblage includes multiple individuals of different ages, while the chamber lacks the broad mixture of large animal remains expected from an ordinary death trap or carnivore den. Some skeletal elements remain associated closely enough to suggest that bodies, rather than loose collections of bones, decomposed in or near the places where they were found. Researchers supporting burial also describe shallow depressions that interrupt older cave floor deposits, contain disturbed sediment, and hold bones at varying depths and angles. Taken together, these features allow a coherent reconstruction. Living members of Homo naledi entered the dark zone, created or used hollows in the floor, placed dead individuals within them, and returned sediment over the bodies. This explanation gains force because it addresses several problems at once. It accounts for the remote destination, the repeated presence of one hominin species, the survival of small bones, the partial anatomical associations, and the apparent concentration of remains within bounded features. A natural process may explain one of these observations, but supporters argue that no proposed natural process yet explains the entire pattern as economically. Powerful water transport should leave sorting, abrasion, or a clearer route. Carnivore activity should leave a recognizable faunal mixture or feeding damage. Repeated accidental entry should explain how individuals of different ages reached the same inaccessible region and why their remains became concentrated in particular areas. An unknown entrance remains possible, but a possibility without geological evidence cannot settle the question. The burial hypothesis therefore offers something more than a dramatic image. It offers a physical sequence that can be tested against sediments, joints, fractures, chemical patterns, and the shape of the cave floor. Yet, a coherent explanation is not the same as a demonstrated one. Every element in the reconstruction contains uncertainty. The proposed pit boundaries are incomplete. Sediments in caves can slump, crack, and settle around decomposing bodies. Bones can move vertically or sideways as soft tissue disappears. A naturally formed hollow can receive a body without having been dug. Several individuals can overlap and create an arrangement that appears more orderly after excavation than it was during deposition. Even the deep location, perhaps the most persuasive feature for many listeners, cannot tell us who moved the bodies or whether the same route existed in its present form. This is where the beginning of human mortuary behavior becomes especially difficult to recognize. The first intentional placement of a dead body would not necessarily resemble a later cemetery. It may have left no objects, no stone marker, no fixed posture, and no durable sign of belief. If Homo naledi performed such an act, the evidence might be exactly as modest and damaged as the features now under debate. But modest evidence cannot be protected from criticism merely because ancient behavior was likely subtle. The claim must still survive independent analysis and comparison with natural cave deposits. The strongest case, then, is cumulative rather than decisive. The chamber, the repeated bodies, the proposed hollows, and the patterns of decomposition point toward deliberate placement when viewed together. They make burial scientifically plausible and worthy of careful testing. They do not yet reveal ceremony, grief, symbolism, or a belief about what followed death. They do not even compel every specialist to accept that a grave was created. What they preserve is a narrow possibility with enormous consequences. A small-brained human lineage may have treated dead companions through repeated, organized action long before such behavior was once expected. The evidence brings that possibility close enough to examine, but not close enough to turn uncertainty into recovered memory within the cave itself. A claim can be important without being accepted, and the proposed burials of Homo naledi illustrate why that distinction matters. If bodies were deliberately placed beneath the floor of Rising Star, the finding would weaken a familiar assumption that complex treatment of the dead appeared only among humans with large brains. It could suggest that organized mortuary behavior developed under conditions very different from those once imagined. Because the consequences are so broad, however, the evidence must do more than make intentional burial possible. It must show that deliberate placement explains the deposits better than natural hollows, sediment movement, decomposition, collapse, or other processes acting inside the cave. This demand is sometimes summarized by saying that an extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence. But the principle is not meant to protect old ideas from change. It means that the strength of a conclusion should match the strength and completeness of the observations supporting it. A small claim may survive with a limited pattern. A claim that alters the known beginning of human behavior must survive several independent tests. For Rising Star, those tests begin with excavation records. Archaeologists need detailed maps showing where each bone lay, how it was angled, which sediment surrounded it, and whether nearby layers continued beneath or were cut by the proposed feature. Photographs and three-dimensional models must preserve relationships that cannot be recreated after bones are removed. Sediment samples need to be taken from inside and outside the suspected grave so that texture, chemistry, layering, and microscopic structure can be compared. If a pit was dug and refilled, traces of that disturbance may remain even when the color of the soil appears similar. If no such traces survive, the interpretation must rely more heavily on body position, geological context, and the exclusion of natural alternatives. The difficulty is that caves are active environments. Mud settles unevenly, thin layers crack and curl, water enters in small amounts, voids open as soft tissue disappears, allowing bones to rotate or sink. Later pressure can compress a deposit until its original boundaries become indistinct. These processes do not automatically explain the Homo naledi remains, but they must be documented carefully before depression can be identified as a human-made grave. Independent review is equally important. Specialists who were not involved in the excavation may notice geological or anatomical patterns that the original team interpreted differently. Disagreement does not mean that one side is dishonest or that science has failed. It is a method for testing whether the same physical evidence leads trained observers toward the same conclusion. The history of research into human origins contains many discoveries that became stronger after criticism, as well as interpretations that were narrowed when additional evidence appeared. Rising Star deserves the same process. The small brain of Homo naledi should neither disqualify burial in advance nor lower the standard needed to demonstrate it. Surprise is not evidence against the claim, but surprise is also not evidence for it. The beginning of human treatment of the dead cannot be located by choosing the most moving possibility. It must be approached through layers of sediment, the condition of joints, the movement of fragments, and results that other researchers can examine and, where possible, reproduce. Until those lines agree more clearly, deliberate burial remains a serious hypothesis with potentially great significance, not a completed fact about a vanished population. The distinction also protects the public understanding of the discovery. Once an ancient scene is described as a burial, listeners may naturally imagine mourners, ritual, and belief, although none of those meanings follows directly from covered remains. Careful language keeps observation separate from interpretation. It allows the evidence to remain valuable even if the proposed graves are later reclassified. The chamber would still preserve an unusual concentration of an extinct human relative, and the unresolved route of the bodies would continue to require a more complete scientific explanation. Natural processes do not need to produce a simple or dramatic scene. Inside a cave, slow changes can overlap until the final deposit looks organized even when no one planned it. This is why critics of the burial interpretation ask whether the proposed graves could have formed through combinations of existing hollows, decomposing bodies, shifting mud, and the gradual settling of the floor. A shallow depression may begin as an irregular low point created by erosion or the collapse of soft sediment. If a body entered that space, whether alive, carried, or moved by some other process, its weight could press downward and reshape the surrounding material. As flesh disappeared, empty spaces would open beneath ribs, limbs, and the torso. Sediment could move into those spaces, allowing bones to sink, tilt, rotate, or become separated vertically. The result might resemble a body placed within a prepared pit, even if no digging occurred. Thin layers of cave mud create another difficulty. They can dry, crack, curl, break, and later become covered by new sediment. A broken edge around a concentration of bones may therefore look like the boundary of a cut, although it could belong to a naturally fragmented floor. Water does not need to flow as a powerful underground stream to influence such a deposit. Small amounts moving through cracks, dripping from ceilings, or spreading through loose soil can carry fine particles without transporting large bones over long distances. Repeated wetting and drying may weaken layers, change their color, and make disturbed sediment difficult to distinguish from material altered by decomposition. Gravity continues working after water disappears. A sloping surface can move fragments gradually, while pressure from accumulating mud can push one bone beneath another. These possibilities do not explain the rising star remains by themselves. They are mechanisms that must be compared with the observed pattern. Critics also ask whether bodies could have decomposed on the cave floor and later become covered naturally. Sediment falling from walls or ceilings, material moved by small animals, and slow accumulation through countless minor events may conceal remains without deliberate backfilling. In that case, associated hands, feet, or vertebrae could still survive because the bodies decayed near where they were found. The presence of several individuals would then require repeated entry or deposition, but repetition is not unique to human intention. The same hazardous route, natural opening, or attractive shelter could affect different individuals across a long interval. No clear version of such a process has yet been demonstrated for every body, and an unknown route cannot be accepted merely because it is convenient, yet deliberate burial also cannot be accepted merely because natural alternatives remain incomplete. The beginning of human behavior is often hidden within this uncomfortable balance. Archaeologists rarely choose between a perfect natural explanation and a perfect cultural one. They compare damaged records in which several causes may have acted together. A body might have been intentionally moved into the cave but left on an existing hollow rather than buried. It might have been covered later by natural sediment. Another individual might have entered under different circumstances. Such mixed histories can produce a deposit that resists one universal account. This is why sediment, micromorphology, chemistry, refitting of fragments, bone orientation, and precise three-dimensional recording are so important. They can reveal whether layers were cut, whether soil was mixed before or after decomposition, and whether movement followed a consistent physical direction. Until those observations converge, the natural alternatives remain neither proven explanations nor empty objections. They are reminders that caves can imitate traces of action, while action can leave marks so subtle that geology nearly erases them. Only a fuller record can show which traces belong to ancient choice and which emerged silently after bodies arrived. The question is not whether nature can create complexity. It is whether nature can account for this particular complexity more completely than deliberate placement can. What would move the rising star debate closer to an answer is not a stronger story, but a stronger chain of evidence. The first need is a complete three-dimensional record of every proposed burial feature, showing with greater precision the exact position, depth, angle, and relationship of each bone before removal. Such records allow other researchers to test whether a skeleton collapsed within a confined hollow, shifted through loose sediment, or accumulated through several episodes. The second need is a detailed study of the sediments themselves. Microscopic slices of sediment can reveal whether layers were cut, mixed, compressed, or redeposited. Grain size, mineral composition, organic traces, and the orientation of tiny particles may show whether soil was returned after digging or moved gradually through water and gravity. Chemical differences around a decomposed body can also indicate whether soft tissue broke down in place, although decomposition alone does not prove burial. A third line of evidence comes from the bones. Researchers can test whether nearby fragments refit, whether small elements remained with larger ones, and whether joints separated in a pattern expected from a body decomposing where it was found. Surface damage, mineral staining, and fractures may help establish when movement occurred. None of these observations is decisive alone. Their value grows when they support the same sequence without depending on one another. Independent excavation and review would add another layer of confidence. When specialists who did not develop the original interpretation examine the deposits, methods, images, and samples, they may confirm the proposed boundaries or identify processes that were overlooked. Repeated results matter because cave deposits can be read differently when only a limited area is exposed. Broader excavation may reveal whether the suspected hollows repeat in shape, depth, and relation to bodies, or whether they merge into irregular natural depressions across the chamber floor. Dating also remains important. If separate concentrations formed at different times, that could support repeated use of the space, though repeated use would still not explain motive. If they formed within one shorter interval, a different history might be required. At the beginning of human mortuary behavior, the most valuable evidence may be pattern rather than drama. Several bodies placed in similar ways, within similarly altered sediments, would be harder to explain as coincidence than one ambiguous concentration. A clear cut through an older layer, followed by fill that differs microscopically from undisturbed soil, would strengthen the case for digging. A body positioned within that cut, with anatomical relationships showing decomposition there, would strengthen it further. By contrast, continuous natural layers beneath and around the bones, combined with signs of settling into pre-existing hollows, would weaken the burial interpretation. Science may never recover every step. Some cave regions remain difficult to reach, some deposits have already been disturbed, and geological change has erased information that cannot be recreated. Even an accepted burial would not reveal whether the act arose from attachment, hygiene, fear, habit, or a meaning no modern category can express. The strongest possible conclusion may therefore remain limited. Bodies were intentionally placed and covered, while the reason remains unknown. That limit is not a failure. It is a truthful boundary between action and thought. Rising Star matters because it forces researchers to test how much behavior can be reconstructed from damaged material without turning uncertainty into fantasy. More precise excavation, independent sediment analysis, repeated patterns, and transparent publication can narrow the possibilities. They may show that Homo naledi altered the cave floor for the dead, or that natural processes created an appearance of burial. The answer must emerge from material relationships that remain visible to observers who did not begin with the expectation or desired conclusion. Until then, the chamber does not ask science to choose belief over skepticism. It asks whether enough independent traces can survive together to distinguish an ancient decision from the slow work of darkness, water, stone, and time. For much of the study of human origins, brain size seemed to offer a simple scale. Fossil skulls could be measured, their internal volume estimated, and species arranged from smaller brains to larger ones. Because living humans possess unusually large brains for our body size, the upward trend appeared to tell a reassuring story. Early ancestors were placed near the beginning, later humans near the top, and increasing intelligence was imagined as the force carrying evolution forward. This picture was never entirely without evidence. Across several branches of Homo, average brain size did increase over long periods, and larger brains brought important biological possibilities. More neural tissue can support additional processing, longer development, and wider networks of connection. Yet the old scale quietly turned association into certainty. It treated the size of the container as though it measured the contents of a vanished life. It also encouraged a moral ranking in which species with smaller skulls seemed less human, less social, and less capable of actions that modern observers considered meaningful. Homo naledi unsettles that habit because its small brain existed in a body that survived much later than such anatomy was once expected to endure. The skull does not fit the comfortable sequence, in which every recent human must possess a larger brain than every ancient one. More importantly, its possible connection with deliberate treatment of the dead exposes how strongly interpretation can be guided by expectation. If researchers begin by believing that burial requires a large brain, then evidence associated with a small brain species may be dismissed before the deposit is fully examined. If they become excited by the challenge to that belief, they may accept burial too quickly because it promises a dramatic revision. Both reactions allow skull size to decide what the cave should mean. A more careful approach begins by separating several questions. How large was the brain relative to the body? How was its surface organized? What behaviors are securely associated with the fossils? Which abilities can be inferred from anatomy? And which remain beyond recovery? These questions overlap, but none can replace the others. Among living species, brains of different sizes solve ecological and social problems in different ways. Total volume does not reveal the number of neurons in every region, the density of connections, the duration of childhood learning, or the knowledge preserved within a group. Even two humans with different brain volumes cannot be ranked reliably by intelligence from that difference alone. Across extinct species, where soft tissue, development, and observed behavior are missing, the uncertainty becomes far greater. This does not make brain size irrelevant. A brain is metabolically costly, and evolutionary enlargement changes the demands placed on pregnancy, growth, diet, and social care. The expansion seen in parts of the human lineage was a major biological development. But it was not a single switch that changed an unthinking creature into a thinking one. The beginning of humanity was distributed across bodies and generations. Upright movement, skilled hands, prolonged learning, cooperation, memory, and communication did not necessarily appear together or advance at the same pace. Different branches could retain different combinations. Just as Homo naledi retained a small brain beside feet and hands with more derived features. The old ladder made those combinations look contradictory because it assumed that every trait should climb in one direction. Branching evolution makes them expected. A lineage needs only to remain workable within its own conditions, not to approach the anatomy of people living today. The skulls from Rising Star therefore establish a limit, not a verdict. They tell us that Homo naledi had substantially less brain volume than Homo sapiens. They do not tell us whether its members recognized individuals, learned routes, maintained traditions, cared for bodies, or understood absence after death. Those possibilities must be judged through evidence of action, not awarded or denied by a measurement made inside an empty skull. A brain does not work as a container filled with a fixed amount of intelligence. Its abilities depend on how regions are organized, how they communicate, how the body supplies information, and how experience changes connections during growth. In an extinct species, most of this living system is gone. The inside of a skull may preserve broad impressions of the brain's outer surface, but it cannot reveal the fine wiring that once joined one region to another. For Homo naledi, reconstructed brain surfaces suggest that some frontal areas may have been organized in ways more similar to other members of Homo than the small overall volume would lead many people to expect. This observation matters because size and organization do not always change together. A lineage can retain a small brain while particular regions alter in shape or proportion, yet the evidence remains coarse. A surface impression cannot show the number of neurons, the strength of their connections, or the way attention and memory operated in daily life. It cannot demonstrate language, foresight, shared symbols, or an understanding of death. The living body also formed part of cognition. Hands gathered information through touch. Feet in balance guided movement through uneven ground. Vision, hearing, smell, and the sense of body position helped individuals learn routes and recognize danger. A brain worked through these systems rather than apart from them. Homo naledi possessed hands, capable of controlled gripping, feet suited to upright walking, and a body that moved successfully through its environment across many generations. These facts show functional coordination, but they do not disclose the complexity of thought behind any particular action. Another part of intelligence may have existed between individuals. Social animals do not solve every problem alone. Young members observe older ones, familiar routes are followed repeatedly, and useful responses can spread through a group. A behavior does not need to be rediscovered by every generation if it can be learned through attention and repetition. Human culture carries this process to an extraordinary degree, but simpler forms of social learning occur in many living species. Whether Homo naledi maintained enduring traditions is unknown. No preserved sequence of tools, marks, or living observations allows scientists to describe its teaching or communication. Still, the possibility of group learning changes the question raised by the cave. Navigating a difficult underground route, returning to a location, or treating bodies in a repeated way would not depend only on the private abilities of one brain. Such actions could involve shared familiarity, coordinated movement, and habits carried across time. This does not prove that any of those behaviors occurred. It explains why measuring one skull cannot establish the limits of an entire population. The beginning of human social life was not stored inside a single anatomical feature. It emerged through bodies that depended on one another, young individuals who required time to mature, and groups in which experience could outlast the individual who first acquired it. Fossils can sometimes reveal prolonged growth or physical dependence, but they cannot restore the gestures and responses through which knowledge passed. This loss is especially important when considering death. A group may react to a dead member through attachment, disturbance, avoidance, practical removal, or repeated custom. None of these reactions necessarily requires a modern concept of ritual. None can be inferred directly from a frontal lobe impression. If the rising star bodies were deliberately moved, the evidence would reveal organized action before it revealed the mental categories behind that action. If they were not moved deliberately, the shape of the brain would not rescue the burial claim. Organization, connection, body, and social learning remind us that cognition is more than volume, but they do not turn possibility into proof. Homo naledi therefore remains beyond both easy dismissal and easy elevation. Its skull permits questions that its bones and sediments must still answer through evidence preserved within the cave itself. Even the best preserved skull cannot return the mind that once lived inside it. Fossils may show the size of a brain case, the broad shape of its surface, and the relationship between the head and the rest of the body. They may suggest that certain regions were organized differently from those of earlier hominids. But no fossil can recover a remembered face, a learned route, a private fear, or the meaning attached to a dead companion. This limit is not unique to Homo naledi. It applies to every extinct human population, including those much closer to us in anatomy. A large skull does not preserve a belief, and a small skull does not erase the possibility of learned behavior. The gap between structure and experience remains enormous. Scientists can compare endocasts, examine grooves left by blood vessels, and estimate how the brain fitted within the skull. These methods provide useful information about evolution, yet they cannot recreate the activity that passed through living neural networks. A brain changes through development, injury, nutrition, repeated practice, and social contact. None of these histories is written clearly on the inner wall of the cranium. Even among living people, where behavior can be observed and brains can be studied in detail, simple links between one shape and one mental ability often fail across hundreds of thousands of years. With only bone remaining, certainty becomes even less justified. This is why the rising star debate must not become a contest between two imagined minds. One side cannot say that Homo naledi was too limited to move or cover the dead merely because its brain was small. The other cannot claim that a more human-like frontal shape proves planning, symbolism, or ritual. Both arguments begin with an answer and use anatomy to protect it. The cave requires the opposite approach. First, establish what happened to the bodies. Then ask what range of behavior could produce that pattern. Even after deliberate placement were demonstrated, the meaning of the act would remain open. A body may be moved because it blocks a living area, attracts scavengers, carries a disturbing smell, or belongs to an individual whose absence changes the group. Covering the dead may arise from practical need, learned custom, emotional attachment, or several causes at once. Modern categories such as funeral, religion, grief, and ceremony may overlap with the behavior, or they may distort it. The beginning of human awareness did not leave a dictionary behind. It left material traces that survive unevenly and must be interpreted without forcing them into familiar names. Homo naledi therefore presents a double uncertainty. The physical claim of burial remains disputed, and the mental meaning of any deliberate act would remain even harder to recover. This does not make the question empty. It makes the evidence more valuable, because each surviving detail can test action without pretending to restore thought. A repeated route through darkness, a body placed within a hollow, or sediment returned over remains would reveal coordination and choice if securely demonstrated. They would not reveal what words were spoken, whether silence was observed, or whether the dead were imagined as continuing somewhere beyond the cave. Those possibilities belong to stories unless further evidence appears. The cold fact of evolution is that minds disappear almost completely. Bodies sometimes endure, but the inner worlds that guided them do not. Entire lineages lived, learned, recognized others, and vanished without leaving a single recoverable thought. Rising star may preserve one rare boundary between body and behavior, yet it cannot cross the final distance into intention. Science can narrow the possibilities, but it cannot make a silent skull speak with the certainty of a witness. The skull can show the space where a brain once worked. The cave can show where bones finally rested. Between those two records lies the vanished experience of a human relative whose understanding of death may never be known. Death does not become meaningful only when a grave is dug. Among living social animals, the body of a dead group member can provoke attention, hesitation, touching, guarding, avoidance, or a temporary change in ordinary movement. These reactions do not prove that animals possess a human concept of mortality, and they do not reveal belief in an afterlife. They show something simpler and more secure. A familiar body can remain socially important after life has ended. For ancient human relatives, this distinction matters because behavior toward the dead may have begun long before formal ritual, spoken explanation, or symbolic objects appeared. A group did not need theology to notice that one member no longer moved, responded, or returned. The absence itself could alter the behavior of those who remained. In primates, elephants, cetaceans, and some other social species, Researchers have documented varied responses to corpses, but no single pattern applies to all individuals or situations. Some remain nearby, some inspect the body. Some mothers carry dead infants for a time, others withdraw quickly. These observations must be interpreted cautiously because outward behavior cannot provide direct access to inner thought. A prolonged touch may reflect attachment, confusion, sensory investigation, or several causes together. The same caution applies even more strongly to extinct hominins. No one observed Homo naledi encounter death. No gesture, sound, or expression survived in the cave. Yet the possibility of social response should not be dismissed merely because its brain was small. Recognition, attachment, and disruption can arise within social systems that are far older than our species. Human beings did not invent every emotional foundation from nothing. We inherited capacities shaped through deep evolutionary time, then transformed them through language, memory, and culture. The earliest responses to death may therefore have been practical and social at once. A corpse changes smell, temperature, posture, and the safety of a living space. It may attract scavengers, block movement, or remain beside individuals who continue to recognize its form. Moving it could reduce danger while also ending repeated contact with a familiar body. These motives are not mutually exclusive. A useful action can become a repeated custom, and a repeated custom can carry social meaning without requiring a fully developed doctrine. This is why the rising star question cannot be reduced to a choice between meaningless disposal and modern funeral ritual. If Homo naledi deliberately moved bodies, the action may have belonged somewhere between those categories, or outside them entirely. The cave would then preserve a response to death without preserving the concepts that shaped it. At the beginning of human history, such responses may have emerged gradually through ordinary group life. Individuals depended on one another for awareness, movement, protection, and learning. The death of one member could change the group even when no one understood death as an abstract universal. A body that no longer participated was both physically present and socially absent. That contradiction may have been enough to produce attention. It may also have encouraged repeated ways of handling the dead, especially if groups occupied familiar places over many generations. Such a transition would not occur in one generation or one species. Different populations may have approached dead bodies in different ways, shaped by habitat, predators, mobility, and social bonds. Most responses vanished without preservation. Only rare combinations of place, bone, and sediment could carry a faint physical consequence into the present. None of this proves that rising star was used for mortuary behavior. It only clarifies why deliberate treatment of a corpse would not automatically require religion. Before graves became monuments, before names were written, and before beliefs could be recorded, social beings were already capable of noticing loss. The hardest question is not whether ancient humans possessed modern ideas. It is how a simple recognition of irreversible absence might have become an action repeated often enough to leave a trace in stone and sediment. Moving a dead body, managing its presence, and burying it are not the same action. The distinction matters because each leaves a different kind of evidence and requires a different level of inference. A body may be moved a short distance from where death occurred. It may be carried away from a sleeping place, a feeding area, or a route used by the living. Such movement can reduce smell, discourage scavengers, or remove an obstacle. It can also arise from attachment or repeated social habit. The physical act alone does not reveal which motive mattered most. Disposal is a broader term. It describes any way a group separates dead bodies from ordinary activity, whether by leaving them in a distant place, placing them in water, exposing them in the open, moving them into a cave, or covering them with material. Disposal can be practical, learned, and socially organized without involving a grave. Burial is narrower. It usually requires evidence that a body was placed within a depression and intentionally covered after the ground was altered. The difference is not merely a matter of vocabulary, it determines what archaeologists are justified in claiming. If the Homo naledi bodies were carried into Rising Star and left on the cave floor, that would still represent deliberate treatment of the dead. It would not, by itself, demonstrate that pits were dug. If natural sediment later covered those bodies, the final appearance might resemble burial, even though the original action was placement without covering. If existing hollows were used, the behavior would differ again from creating new graves. These possibilities form a sequence of increasing material commitment, but they are not a ladder of increasing humanity. A group that moved corpses away from living space was not necessarily less socially aware than a group that covered them. Different environments create different choices. Hard ground, available tools, predators, seasonal movement, and the depth of soil can all shape what becomes possible. At the beginning of human mortuary behavior, repeated action may have emerged from problems. A dead individual could no longer follow the group. A body might remain close to a familiar shelter while changing through decomposition. Living members had to continue moving, resting, and avoiding danger. Removing the body could become a remembered solution. Returning to the same place could become a custom. Covering the remains could follow later, or rise independently in another population. None of these transitions needs to occur in a planned sequence. Evolution and culture preserve workable actions, not a universal path toward modern funerals. This is why the Rising Star evidence must be described with precision. The deep location may support deliberate transport. The concentration of several individuals may support repeated use of the cave. Anatomical association among some bones may suggest that bodies entered before complete decomposition. Proposed depressions and disturbed sediments may support intentional covering, but each claim rests on a different layer of evidence. Proving one does not automatically prove the others. Deliberate transport would not establish burial. Burial would not establish ceremony. Ceremony would not automatically establish religion or a belief in another world. The meanings familiar to living people cannot be carried backward simply because the dead were treated differently from ordinary refuse. For Homo naledi, the most defensible question may begin below the level of belief. Did living individuals recognize a dead body as something requiring a repeated response? If they moved it, was the route chosen for practical separation, social significance, or both? If they covered it, did that action arise from learned custom rather than abstract ideas about death? The cave may eventually distinguish movement from covering more than it can distinguish hygiene from attachment. That limit matters. It allows an ancient action to remain meaningful without forcing it into a funeral. Before anyone can ask what the dead represented, science must establish exactly what living hands, bodies, sediment, and time did. If Homo naledi deliberately moved or covered its dead, the action would still remain separated from its meaning by a distance that archaeology cannot easily cross. Because the same physical behavior can arise from very different pressures within a social group. A body may be removed because it attracts scavengers, because its smell changes a shelter, because its presence blocks movement, because others continue to recognize it, or because a repeated custom has become part of how the group responds to death, and several of these causes may operate together without any member holding an abstract explanation. This uncertainty matters because modern observers often place ancient actions into familiar categories too quickly. A body in a hollow becomes a funeral, a repeated location becomes a sacred place, and careful treatment becomes proof of grief or belief, yet none of those conclusions can be read directly from bone and sediment. Even among living people, outward actions do not always reveal one simple motive. Families may follow the same practice for practical, emotional, social, and religious reasons at once, and those reasons can change across generations. While the visible behavior remains similar, for a vanished lineage without words, objects, or living witnesses, the uncertainty is far greater. The cave may preserve where bodies rested, whether joints remained connected, whether sediment was disturbed, and whether the same kind of placement happened more than once, but it cannot preserve what individuals expected after death or whether they expected anything at all. This does not reduce the importance of repeated behavior. A custom can shape a group even before it is explained through symbols. Younger individuals may observe how older members respond, routes may become familiar, and one practical solution may become a remembered pattern. Over time, such a pattern could carry social weight simply because it connects present action with earlier generations. Yet this possibility must remain a possibility. There is no evidence that Homo naledi named the dead, remembered ancestors, feared spirits, or believed that life continued beyond the body. There is also no evidence that they regarded a corpse as meaningless material. Both extremes fill silence with modern assumptions. The more careful position is that a deliberate response, if demonstrated, would show that the dead had become part of organized group behavior. While the inner meaning of that response remained unknown, this boundary returns us to the beginning of humanity. Because many capacities associated with modern life may have emerged before they became visible in art, language, monuments, or written belief, attention to absence could precede a theory of death, attachment could precede ceremony, and repeated handling of bodies could precede formal burial. Different human lineages may have crossed these thresholds in different ways. Some practices may have disappeared with the populations that created them, leaving no descendants and no cultural inheritance that reached us. Homo naledi may represent such a lost path, or the cave may preserve a natural accumulation that only resembles one. Science must hold both possibilities without weakening its standards. The educational value lies in that restraint. Evidence can support an action more strongly than a motive, and uncertainty about motive is not permission to invent one. If the proposed burials are eventually confirmed, the most honest conclusion may still be modest. These small-brained humans treated dead bodies through deliberate and repeated behavior, but why they did so remains beyond recovery. The mystery is therefore not a gap waiting for a dramatic answer. It is a boundary showing how much of ancient life vanished when memory, voice, and social meaning failed to fossilize in the quiet space between recognition and understanding, where a familiar body remained present while the living relationship had already ended. And perhaps the deepest question is not whether Homo naledi thought as we do, but whether the first response to death began long before any human lineage possessed words capable of explaining it. Around 300,000 years ago, Africa was not occupied by one uniform human population moving together toward a single future. It was a continent of deserts, grasslands, forests, mountains, river systems, and changing coastlines where groups could remain separated for long periods and follow different evolutionary histories, fossils from northern, eastern, and southern Africa show that human anatomy was already diverse, with early members of the Homo sapiens lineage appearing alongside populations that retained other combinations of older and newer traits. The boundaries between these groups are often uncertain because the record is scattered, many fossils are incomplete, and a scientific name cannot always capture the movement and mixture of real populations. Still, the broad pattern is clear enough to replace the image of a solitary ancestral people. Humanity at that time existed as branches, local populations, and surviving lineages spread across enormous distances. Homo naledi belonged to this wider African world. Yet its presence in southern Africa does not prove that it met early Homo sapiens, shared food with them, copied their behavior, or even occupied the same landscape during the same generation. Dates measured across thousands of years can overlap while individual lives remain separated by distances. No member of either population ever crossed. Climates also changed, opening some habitats, shrinking others, and altering the routes through which animals and humans could move. A region that supported one population during a wetter interval might isolate another when conditions became drier, so coexistence in time should be understood as a broad possibility rather than a scene in which different humans stood face to face. This restraint matters for the bodies in Rising Star, because deliberate treatment of the dead, if it occurred, cannot simply be borrowed from another population living somewhere else in Africa. There is no evidence that Homo naledi learned mortuary behavior from Homo sapiens, and no evidence that early Homo sapiens learned it from Homo naledi. The cave must be interpreted through its own bones, sediments, and geological history, rather than through an imagined exchange between lineages. At the same time, the existence of several forms of humanity changes what the central question means. If different populations with different bodies and brain sizes survive during the same broad age, then no single anatomy can represent all human possibility. One lineage might develop a useful behavior that another never adopted. Similar responses might arise independently under similar social or environmental pressures, and a practice could disappear when the population carrying it vanished. Evolution does not preserve every solution in the descendants living today. It removes entire branches, taking their learned habits, routes, gestures, and relationships with them. This is the evolutionary loss hidden behind the fossils. Homo naledi may have lived within a regional world whose social traditions left almost no durable trace beyond the unusual placement of bodies underground, or those bodies may have reached the chamber without any shared mortuary tradition at all. Both possibilities remain open, but neither can be evaluated properly. While human evolution is imagined as one species waiting to become another, Africa around this time was more like a shifting network than a straight road. Populations could divide, persist, disappear, and perhaps meet again, while anatomical features spread or remain local through processes that are only partly visible in surviving bone. The origin of our species emerged within that complexity, not outside it. And the presence of Homo sapiens did not instantly erase every other human form. Rising Star therefore preserves more than an unusual skeleton. It preserves evidence that a small brain lineage endured within the same broad chapter of African evolution that also contained the early history of ourselves, and this shared time leaves an uncertainty. When human beings began responding deliberately to death, was that capacity confined to one branch, or did several forms of humanity approach the same irreversible absence in ways that left different fragmentary traces. The appearance of Homo sapiens did not mark a single moment when every other human lineage disappeared, because evolution does not replace one population with another in the way a new ruler replaces an old one. Populations can overlap for long periods, remain separated by geography, adapt to different habitats, and vanish at different times. The fossil record often gives the illusion of sudden change, only because many generations are compressed into a few dated layers. Within those layers, countless births, migrations, local extinctions, and changes in climate occurred without leaving a visible trace. Homo naledi belongs to this slower and more uneven history. Its known remains fall within a broad period when early Homo sapiens populations were also present in Africa. Yet the existence of both lineages during the same broad age does not tell us whether they shared territory, exchanged knowledge, or even came within sight of one another. Southern Africa alone contained varied landscapes that could isolate groups through distance, water, vegetation, and changing climate. A population might persist in one region while another expanded elsewhere, and their histories could unfold independently even though their fossils later receive overlapping dates. This matters because modern people often imagine the emergence of our species as a wave that moved across the continent and immediately erased everything before it. But biological change is rarely that clean. A small population can survive in a protected environment long after related forms disappear, while a newer population may remain limited to distant regions for many generations. Some lineages may decline slowly. Others may merge through interbreeding, and still others may vanish without contributing clearly to later populations. For Homo naledi, no genetic evidence currently shows whether any contact with other humans occurred, and no archaeological object can securely demonstrate cultural exchange. The safest conclusion is therefore that several forms of humanity may have occupied Africa during overlapping spans of time, each carrying a separate history that is only partly preserved. This broader setting changes how the rising star bodies are understood. If deliberate treatment of the dead occurred there, it need not have been copied from Homo sapiens, and it need not represent an early stage on a direct road toward modern funerals. The behavior could have emerged independently within a lineage whose social world later disappeared. Just as similar practical solutions can arise among groups facing similar problems without direct contact. Moving a corpse away from a living area, returning to a known location, or covering remains can result from local experience and repeated habit, but none of these actions can be assumed from the date alone. The cave evidence must still carry the claim. Coexistence only removes the false expectation that one kind of human owned every complex possibility. The beginning of humanity was distributed across several bodies and several histories, not concentrated entirely within the ancestors of living people. This is the deeper loss revealed by extinction. When a lineage disappears, its anatomy may survive in fragments, but its learned routes, social customs, and responses to death usually vanish without descendants to preserve them. Homo naledi may have carried ways of living that no later population inherited, or the chamber may preserve no deliberate mortuary behavior at all. Both possibilities remain scientifically open, yet either possibility teaches the same historical lesson. The rise of Homo sapiens did not instantly simplify the human world. For a long time, that world may have contained different forms of upright walking, different brain sizes, different social systems, and different answers to the pressures of survival. Only later did one lineage remain widely visible, making the earlier diversity easy to forget. When we look back from the present, survival can appear like superiority, but continued existence does not prove that every lost lineage lacked complexity. It only means that history preserved one branch and removed the others before their full stories could ever reach us. The possibility that Homo naledi deliberately treated its dead does not require us to imagine a hidden civilization beneath the earth. Nor does it prove that every human lineage shared the same mental world. What it changes is something quieter and more fundamental: the assumption that complex behavior must belong only to bodies and brains that resemble our own. For a long time, researchers often connected larger brains with planning, symbolism, cooperation, and care for the dead because the clearest archaeological examples of graves, ornaments, and art were associated with later humans whose anatomy was closer to ours. This pattern encouraged a simple conclusion. First, brains became large, then behavior became complex, yet evolution rarely follows such a clean order. Different capacities can emerge at different times, in different populations, under different environmental and social pressures, and some of those capacities may disappear when the population carrying them becomes extinct. If the rising star features are eventually confirmed as intentional burials, they would not show that Homo naledi thought like Homo sapiens. They would show that a small-brained lineage could coordinate repeated actions toward dead bodies, remember a difficult location, and perhaps maintain a shared practice across more than one event. Even that conclusion would need careful limits. Organized action is not the same as religion. Repeated behavior is not automatic proof of symbolism, and a covered body does not reveal what the living believed, but the physical act alone would widen the known range of human behavior. It would suggest that attention to the dead may have developed on more than one branch of the human family, or that the foundations of such behavior reach deeper into our shared ancestry than the surviving fossil record currently reveals. Either possibility would weaken the idea that our lineage crossed one unique threshold while every other form of humanity remained outside it. This does not make all human species equal in every ability, anatomy, ecology, and social life differed, and the evidence for one behavior cannot be used to fill every missing part of a vanished world. Homo naledi cannot be credited with art, language, ritual, tools, or spiritual belief simply because burial is proposed. Each claim requires its own material support. The importance lies not in adding modern qualities to an extinct species, but in allowing evolution to remain diverse, branching, and incomplete. The beginning of humanity was not a single awakening inside one skull. It was a long accumulation of capacities distributed across bodies, generations, and populations. Some branches may have carried strong social memory without large brains. Others may have developed complex tools without formal burial, and still others may have left behaviors that disappeared without archaeological preservation. The present world contains only one surviving human species, which makes our traits appear unified and exclusive, but the past may have divided those traits among several forms of humanity, each holding only part of what later came together in us. Rising Star stands near this uncertainty. Its bones do not prove that Homo naledi crossed a mental boundary, yet they prevent us from drawing that boundary too confidently around ourselves. If natural processes created the deposits, the cave will remain a lesson in geological complexity and scientific caution. If deliberate burial is demonstrated, it will become evidence that social responses to death were not dependent on a brain shaped exactly like ours. Both outcomes carry value because both replace certainty with a more accurate picture of human origins. A world where several lineages lived beside one another, followed separate histories, and may have reached familiar problems through unfamiliar minds. Their vanished difference may be the reason the cave feels familiar and strange, preserving an action whose place in evolution remains unresolved today. The question is therefore not whether Homo naledi was secretly modern, but whether the qualities we call human were ever contained within only one branch at all. Extinction does not always arrive as a single catastrophe that leaves a visible boundary in the earth. Sometimes a population becomes smaller across many generations, its habitats change, its births no longer replace its deaths, and the final members disappear without any event dramatic enough to enter the geological record. This may be what happened to Homo naledi, but the evidence does not reveal when its lineage ended, what pressures affected it, or whether its last communities survived beyond the individuals known from Rising Star. The dated fossils show that this human relative existed during a comparatively recent period of African evolution, yet they do not identify its first appearance or its final generation. Between those limits lies an unknown history that may have lasted far longer than the cave deposit itself. No secure evidence shows that Homo naledi was a direct ancestor of Homo sapiens, and its unusual anatomy may instead represent a separate branch whose roots divided from other members of Homo much earlier. A branch can live beside another without leading into it, just as two rivers can cross the same region while flowing toward different endings. This matters because extinct humans are often described only by how closely they approach us. Their feet, hands, skulls, and teeth are measured against modern bodies. Then their place is judged by whether they seem to move toward the form that survived. But Homo naledi did not live as a prediction of Homo sapiens. Its individuals were complete organisms within their own environments. They found food, avoided danger, developed from childhood, and depended on conditions that supported generation after generation. Although the details of those lives remain unknown, survival for any lineage requires only that enough individuals continue. Not that their bodies resemble a future species. When that continuity ended, the loss was larger than the disappearance of a single skull shape. Every learned route through the landscape vanished, every repeated response within the group ended, and every way of recognizing companions ceased to be transmitted. If the dead were deliberately placed within Rising Star, the meaning and practice of that behavior disappeared as well, leaving only material consequences that modern researchers may not be able to separate fully from geology. If no deliberate placement occurred, an equally large world of ordinary behavior was still lost because anatomy preserves only a narrow portion of existence. Even new methods that recover ancient proteins from dental enamel can offer limited biological information while leaving speech, memory, attachment, and social rules unreachable. Molecular traces may refine which individuals are represented or how the species relates to others, but they cannot restore a lineage as a living community. This is the cold loss built into human evolution. Most forms of humanity left no continuing voice. Some contributed genes to later populations. Others may have vanished without a detectable biological legacy. And still others remain too poorly understood for either possibility to be established. Homo naledi belongs within that uncertainty. Its fossils prove presence, not ancestry, and its disappearance should not be turned into a confident story of competition, climate failure, violence, or inferiority, any of those forces may have mattered, but none has been demonstrated as the cause of extinction. The responsible image is quieter. A distinct human form occupied part of Africa, persisted through an unknown sequence of generations, and then ceased to appear in the surviving record. The cave returned its bones to science, but not the moment when the last living member looked out across a landscape. No descendant would remember. The silence around that ending is not evidence that their lives were simple. It is the ordinary result of preservation, which favors hard tissues and durable sediments over relationships, habits, and shared knowledge. What remains is an evolutionary branch, whose ending removed not only bodies, but an entire way of being human that can now be approached only through fragments. Bones survive because mineralized tissue can resist decay long after muscles, skin, and organs disappear. But most of what makes a life recognizable is carried in materials that vanish quickly. A route remembered through the landscape leaves no fossil unless repeated movement changes the ground. A gesture between companions disappears the moment it ends, and a response to death can endure only if it alters stone, sediment, bone, or some other durable surface. This imbalance shapes everything known about Homo naledi. Because the chamber preserves bodies more clearly than the behavior surrounding them, researchers can measure a femur, compare a tooth, map a skull fragment, and study layers of cave mud. Yet they cannot recover the sounds made during movement, the signals used in darkness, or the social ties that may have connected one individual to another. Even if deliberate placement of the dead is eventually demonstrated, the act would remain only the outer shell of a vanished practice. The timing, repetition, participants, and meaning would still be incomplete. Perhaps bodies were moved soon after death. Perhaps after a delay. Perhaps only certain individuals were taken inward. Or perhaps the deposits formed through processes that involved no deliberate mortuary behavior at all. The surviving material can narrow these possibilities, but it cannot rebuild the full sequence without evidence. This is why behavior is one of the greatest losses in evolution. Anatomy may persist across hundreds of thousands of years, while learned knowledge can disappear within one broken generation. A group may know where water remains during a dry season, which plants are safe, how to cross dangerous ground, or how to respond when a member no longer moves. None of that knowledge must alter the skeleton, and none is guaranteed to survive when the group ends. Culture, in its broadest sense, depends on transmission. One individual observes another. A useful action is repeated, and a pattern becomes familiar enough to continue beyond the life of the person who first performed it. Whether Homo naledi possessed traditions of this kind cannot be stated with confidence, but any repeated use of rising star would require researchers to consider how knowledge of the place could persist. A deep route is not discovered anew every time if a group returns to it, yet the cave itself does not preserve who remembered, who followed, or whether repeated entry occurred. The beginning of human history is therefore filled with invisible inheritance. Not only genes pass through bodies, but habits pass through attention, proximity, and repetition. Genetic inheritance can sometimes be studied through molecules, while social inheritance usually vanishes unless it leaves tools, hearths, marks, constructions, or patterned deposits. Rising star may contain such a patterned deposit, but that interpretation remains disputed, and its uncertainty reveals how little behavior needs to survive before observers begin building a complete world around it. Restraint is necessary because absence invites invention. No preserved tool can be securely assigned to Homo naledi, no confirmed language can be reconstructed, and no symbolic system can be inferred from the proposed burials alone. The lineage may have possessed complex learned practices, simple repeated routines, or combinations that do not fit modern categories. All were vulnerable to disappearance. When the final group vanished, there was no archive to separate practical action from emotional attachment, no descendant to explain why a body might have entered the cave, and no witness to distinguish a grave from a place later covered by natural sediment. The educational value of this loss is important. Science becomes more trustworthy when it names what cannot be recovered as clearly as what can. The bones tell us that these humans lived, developed, and died. The chamber tells us where some remains came to rest, but the invisible world of memory and custom survives only where repeated action left a material pattern to resist time, and Rising Star still stands at that uncertain boundary. The history of humanity is built from what time failed to destroy, not from a complete record of everyone who lived. Limestone protects some bones, mineral deposits preserve parts of a cave floor, and teeth retain shapes that can be compared across populations, but preservation selects without fairness. One individual may leave much of a skeleton, while thousands of others vanish entirely. One chamber may protect a rare concentration of remains, while every nearby camp, pathway, and resting place disappears. This uneven survival means that the human past can never be read as a continuous account. It must be reconstructed from fragments whose absence is often as important as their presence. Homo naledi makes this limitation unusually clear. The Rising Star fossils reveal a body with a distinctive combination of features, establish that the lineage survived into a relatively recent period, and show that several individuals came to rest within deep parts of the cave. Beyond those observations, each further step requires interpretation. The cave does not preserve a complete route, the bones do not preserve a spoken explanation, and the sediments do not automatically distinguish deliberate action from every natural process. Researchers therefore build models that connect the surviving evidence, then test whether those models remain consistent when new details appear. A useful reconstruction must explain the anatomy, geological setting, distribution of individuals, condition of joints, movement of sediment, and absence of expected signs from alternative processes. Even when one model becomes stronger, it remains a description of probabilities rather than a recovered memory. This is how the history of human origins differs from written history. There are no names, dates of individual lives, or accounts from witnesses. Time is measured in broad ranges, relationships are inferred from anatomy, and behavior appears only where it altered durable matter. The beginning of humanity is therefore visible through scattered consequences, a foot shaped by repeated selection, a hand capable of controlled grip, a tooth formed during childhood, or a body whose final location may reflect action by others. None of these traces is trivial, but none can stand for the whole life that produced it. This perspective protects Homo naledi from two opposite errors. The lineage should not be reduced to a small brain and dismissed as incapable, and it should not be enlarged into a symbolic people whose beliefs are described without evidence. The remains deserve a place between those extremes, as material proof of another way for a human lineage to exist, combined with an unresolved question about how its dead reached the cave. This uncertainty also has educational value, because reliable science does not hide the missing pieces or fill them with certainty. It identifies what is observed, compares explanations, and allows conclusions to remain limited. When the record is limited, future discoveries may clarify the cave floor, reveal more individuals, improve dating, or strengthen one account of deposition. But no discovery can guarantee the return of every gesture, motive, or social meaning. Much of the past has been lost permanently. The evolutionary history leading to living humans is surrounded by branches whose experiences ended without being inherited by us. Homo naledi is one such branch, and its disappearance removed a biological form together with whatever knowledge its groups carried. The cave preserves enough to show that our family was once more diverse than the present suggests, yet not enough to tell us whether its darkness received the dead through accident, repeated placement, or intentional burial. That boundary should not be treated as an invitation to invent. It should be understood as part of the evidence itself. Every careful conclusion, therefore, rests beside a silence, reminding us that evidence can illuminate one narrow path while leaving the surrounding landscape of ancient experience permanently unseen, because the most honest history of humanity includes not only what can be known, but also the immense remainder that time has taken away. After so much uncertainty, the clearest way to understand Rising Star is to separate what the cave establishes from what it only suggests. Homo naledi was a real human relative, known from a large collection of bones and teeth recovered from the Rising Star cave system in South Africa. Its body combined a small brain case and several ancient-looking features, with feet adapted for upright walking and hands capable of controlled gripping. Dating places: the known naledi remains within a broad period between about 236,000 and 335,000 years ago. Although those dates describe the deposits and do not identify the beginning or end of the species, several individuals of different ages are represented, and their remains occur in deep areas of the cave where natural light does not reach. These points are supported by fossil description, geological study, and repeated examination. They do not depend on a story about ritual, emotion, or belief. The uncertainty begins when scientists ask how the bodies arrived. Some skeletal associations and small bones suggest that at least some remains entered the underground setting before complete decomposition, yet the exact routes, timing, and condition of every body cannot be reconstructed. No clearly demonstrated open shaft explains the assemblage as a simple fall from the surface. No ordinary carnivore den or powerful water deposit matches the known pattern well, but removing simple explanations does not automatically prove deliberate burial. Caves change slowly, passages close, sediments settle, bodies collapse, and bones move after soft tissue disappears. The proposed grave features contain concentrations of remains within disturbed or irregular sediment, and researchers who support burial interpret these places as hollows open for bodies and later filled. Critics answer that the boundaries, layering, excavation record, and microscopic sediment evidence have not yet demonstrated intentional digging beyond reasonable dispute. Both positions begin from the same material and differ in how strongly that material supports one sequence of events. Near the early history of Homo sapiens, the presence of another human lineage with a much smaller brain already changes the picture of human evolution. It shows that Africa contained more anatomical diversity than the modern world preserves. But it does not prove that Homo naledi met our ancestors, exchanged knowledge with them, used language, made symbols, controlled fire in the cave, or understood death in a modern way. No secure evidence allows those claims. Even deliberate placement of bodies would establish an action more clearly than a motive. It might reflect practical removal, repeated custom, social attachment, or causes that do not fit any modern category. A grave would not automatically become a funeral. and a funeral would not automatically become religion. The most reliable account, therefore, remains narrow. Homo naledi lived, walked upright, developed through childhood, survived across generations, and left multiple bodies or body parts in remote chambers. Some researchers now argue that these remains were intentionally buried, while other specialists consider the evidence insufficient to exclude natural and mixed processes. Further excavation, detailed spatial recording, independent sediment analysis, and repeated patterns may strengthen one explanation, but no method can guarantee the recovery of thoughts that were never written into durable matter. This boundary is not a weakness hidden inside science. It is one of the reasons scientific knowledge can be trusted. Observations are allowed to remain firm while interpretations remain open, and a title asking why a tiny-brained human buried its dead must therefore remain a question rather than become a conclusion. The cave has given us a species, an age range, an unusual destination, and a disputed material pattern. It has not given us witnesses, words, memories, or certainty about intention. Before the final meaning of rising star can be considered, these different levels of knowledge must remain separate because honesty about what is missing protects the value of everything the fossils genuinely preserve for us. Scientific uncertainty is often mistaken for ignorance, hesitation, or failure. Yet, in the study of human origins, it is one of the clearest signs that evidence is being treated honestly. When researchers disagree about rising star, they are not choosing between science and doubt. They are using doubt as a tool to test how far the surviving material can carry a conclusion. One team may see disturbed sediment, associated bones, and repeated placement as the remains of intentional burial. Another may see natural hollows, collapse, and incomplete documentation that leave too many alternatives open. Both interpretations can be examined because the bones, maps, images, and sediments exist outside the wishes of those studying them. The question is not which explanation feels more human, but which explanation accounts for more observations while requiring fewer unsupported assumptions. This method may appear slow, especially when a discovery attracts public attention. But slowness protects knowledge from becoming a story that cannot later be corrected. A dramatic claim can travel farther than the evidence behind it, and once listeners imagine mourners carrying a body into darkness, the imagined scene may remain, even if later analysis weakens the burial interpretation. Careful language interrupts that process. It says that Homo naledi may have buried its dead, that some researchers interpret certain features as graves, and that scientific agreement has not yet formed. These phrases do not reduce the discovery. They preserve its real value because the chamber remains extraordinary, whether the final explanation is cultural, natural, or mixed. If deliberate burial is confirmed, the result will broaden the known range of behavior among extinct humans. If natural processes prove more persuasive, the case will improve our understanding of how caves rearrange bodies and imitate traces of intention. Either outcome adds knowledge, while premature certainty adds only confidence. The beginning of humanity is especially vulnerable to exaggeration because the surviving record is so small compared with everything that once happened. A few bones may represent generations. A thin layer of sediment may contain events separated by long intervals, and one preserved chamber may appear more central than thousands of vanished places simply because it survived. Science cannot correct this imbalance by inventing the missing world. It can only compare what remains, measure uncertainty, and revise its models when new evidence appears. Revision is not an admission that earlier work was worthless. It is the ordinary movement of reliable knowledge, methods improve, deposits are re-examined, new fossils are found, and interpretations become narrower or stronger. The public value of this process reaches beyond Homo naledi. It teaches that an unanswered question can still be useful when the boundaries of the answer are stated clearly. We know that several members of this lineage reach deep chambers. We know that their anatomy combined features once expected in different periods. And we know that the proposed burials have not convinced every specialist. Beyond that point, honesty requires patience, not because all explanations are equally likely, but because likelihood must be earned through evidence that others can inspect, challenge, and test. The cave therefore offers a lesson about our own desire for certainty. Human beings naturally prefer complete causes, recognizable motives, and stories with a clear beginning and resolution. But the past does not owe us that completeness. Sometimes the most valuable conclusion is a carefully protected question, one that remains open without becoming empty. Rising Star asks us to accept that science may approach an ancient action closely enough to recognize its outline, while still stopping before motive, meaning, and final certainty. And that restraint may be the most truthful tribute we can offer to a vanished human lineage. In that restraint, the unknown is not treated as a weakness to be hidden, but as a boundary marked for future inquiry, allowing evidence to remain stable while explanations change, and allowing wonder to survive without being converted too easily into unsupported fact. In the deepest chambers of Rising Star, the question no longer belongs only to Homo naledi. It returns to us, because every attempt to understand those bodies reveals how easily modern humans confuse resemblance with kinship, brain size with worth, and uncertainty with weakness. The fossils show that a small-brained human lineage lived late enough to share the broad age of early Homo sapiens, walked upright, developed through childhood, and left the remains of several individuals in places far beyond daylight. Some researchers interpret areas of those deposits as deliberate burials, while others argue that natural hollows, sediment movement, collapse, and incomplete documentation have not been excluded. That disagreement must remain visible, because the title asks whether a tiny-brained human buried its dead, not whether science has already proved that it did. The most honest answer is therefore incomplete. Deliberate placement is possible, organized treatment of bodies may have occurred, and the evidence is important enough to test carefully, but the reason cannot be recovered until the physical act itself is established more securely. Even then, motive would remain beyond direct observation. No grave can tell us whether a group acted from attachment, habit, protection, fear, practical need, or a form of meaning that no living language can name. This is the deeper lesson carried by the cave. Humanity did not begin at one clean threshold, where a larger brain suddenly produced every familiar quality. Our history emerged across many populations, bodies, environments, and generations. Some lineages may have held capacities that did not survive into the present, while others may have reached similar solutions through different paths. Extinction erased most of those paths, leaving bones without voices and actions without explanations. Homo naledi may represent one of those lost possibilities, or the deposits may show how geology can imitate human intention. Either outcome matters because both correct a simple story. One would widen the known range of behavior among extinct humans. The other would strengthen our understanding of how ancient caves reshape bodies through time. Science gains value in both cases. When it refuses to protect a dramatic conclusion from criticism, the educational message is not that every mystery must remain unsolved, nor that every interpretation is equally strong. It is that knowledge becomes trustworthy when evidence, inference, and imagination are kept separate. Evidence can tell us where bones rested, inference can compare the processes that placed them there, and imagination can help us picture possibilities. But imagination must never be allowed to announce itself as memory. This discipline protects the dead from being turned into characters who say what we want them to say, and it protects the living from believing that confidence is the same as truth. The chamber has already given something valuable. It has shown that the human family was once broader, stranger, and less orderly than the surviving world suggests. It has shown that bodies with ancient features could persist beside the early history of our own species. And it has shown that the beginning of care, disposal, burial, or ritual may not fit one simple ladder of progress. It also asks us to value patience, because a conclusion reached slowly through transparent methods offers more lasting knowledge than a beautiful reconstruction accepted before its foundations have been independently examined and tested by others over many careful years. The final value of Rising Star lies in this quiet correction. Being human cannot be measured by resemblance to ourselves alone, and the past cannot be made honest by filling every silence. Some silences must remain because they mark the place where evidence ends. As the bones rest beneath layers of stone and sediment, the unanswered question remains beside them, asking how we will ever know when another kind of human first looked upon the dead and understood that absence had changed the living forever, without leaving any explanation that could survive beside them.